The night was black enough that the horizon and the ocean had melted into one endless void. You could almost believe there was no earth at all beneath the ship, only water stretching into eternity. The men were quiet now, but you could still hear the dull creak of wood swelling under the strain, the slap of canvas in the shifting wind, and somewhere below, the sound of the carpenter driving home wedges to keep the planks from opening up under the pressure of the waves. The vessel, barely more than 100 feet long and less than 30 feet wide, carried not just sailors but a fragile piece of an empire in the making. Somewhere in the damp darkness, barrels of salted fish and hard biscuits sweated beside crates of paper records sealed with wax. Those records, boring to anyone not trained to read them, held the tallies of gold dust, the number of men lost to fever, the weight of silver ingots. They were the heartbeat of Spain's growing reach, and now, in the middle of the Atlantic, one plank giving way could erase them all. Welcome to history in ashes. We explore the details. Most people skip the slow, persistent forces that shaped our past. And while the story of how Spain took over half the world is filled with battles, voyages, and rulers whose portraits hang in gilded halls, it's also made up of moments like this. A crew trying not to drown in the dark, hauling the weight of a world that would soon be theirs to claim. Before we go on, could you take a second to tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there? I'd honestly love to know who's listening to this in the middle of the night and who's hearing it with morning coffee. And while you're down there, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It costs less than 1 silver coin, and unlike the Spanish crown, we don't even tax your income. Now, picture yourself on that deck, the boards slick with seawater, your eyes straining to make out the face of the helmsman in the shadows. The man at the wheel isn't steering toward any charted destination. Not really. Navigation here is less about knowing where you are, and more about guessing where you might be in 3 days. Spain's seaborne empire is still in its first breaths, and every crossing of this ocean is an act of faith. The crown is betting on distance, weather, and stubbornness to carry them across the globe, and these voyages are the arteries through which wealth and power will flow. This storm, like so many, is a reminder of how fragile it all is. Salt water eats through ropes, iron rusts, men fall sick without warning. Cargo shifts in the hold and cracks a beam. Any one of these things can send a voyage and all its cargo of empire to the bottom. But this is how Spain is building its reach, not in grand ceremonies or sweeping proclamations, but in small, repeated acts of survival. Crossing, loading, unloading, recording, sending again. What brought them here, to this night in the Atlantic, is a story rooted in the slow grinding of history. Only a few decades earlier, the land they now call Spain was a patchwork of kingdoms that did not trust each other, each with its own laws, languages, and ambitions. There was no single Spanish identity, just rival courts and shifting alliances. The Iberian Peninsula had been a battlefield for centuries, where Muslim and Christian rulers traded territory like pieces in a game neither side could finish. To get from that fractured state to an empire that could stretch across oceans took more than ambition. It took unity, or at least the appearance of it. But here's where the dull parts matter. Unification wasn't a single event. It wasn't even fully complete when Spain began to expand overseas. It was more like the slow binding of threads, royal marriages that tied rival houses together, tax reforms that made armies easier to fund, agreements about coinage, and the enforcement of a shared religion to keep dissent from splitting the seams. None of it was glamorous, but without those tedious steps, no ship would ever have left these shores. That's what the crew on this vessel represents, the output of years of quiet consolidation. The men come from different towns, some speaking Catalan, others Castilian, some with Portuguese cousins they quietly envy or resent. They may not see themselves as part of one great project, but the ledgers in the hold say otherwise. When you think of an empire taking over half the world, you might picture armies storming castles or conquistadors planting flags in new soil. And yes, those things happened. But here's the truth. Spain's expansion relied just as much on record-keeping, shipping schedules, and supply chains as it did on swords. The greatest weapon in their arsenal was not steel, but organization. And organization only works if you can make it survive over long distances. Out here, on a stormy night in the middle of the ocean, those distances are as much an enemy as any rival nation. The Crown's reach will soon stretch from Mexico to Manila, from Lima to Lisbon, but it will always depend on ships like this one. Ships that survive storms, ships that don't run out of fresh water, ships whose pilots can read the stars well enough to miss the reefs. And so the crew works. A man checks the lashings on the barrels, another tightens the lines, someone else shouts to keep the helm steady. They don't know that history will remember them only as numbers in a shipment list, if at all. They don't know they're carrying part of the mechanism that will redraw maps, shift economies, and alter the lives of millions. They just want to see the next port. But here's the question. If every empire depends on thousands of these small, mostly invisible acts of survival, then what really makes an empire powerful? Is it the gold it holds, or the patience to bring that gold home in one piece? Before there was a Spain that could even think about ruling distant lands, there was a peninsula divided not just by borders but by centuries of competing loyalties. If you stood in the plazas of Toledo, Seville, or Barcelona in the middle of the 15th century, you would have felt it in the air, the sense that your world was bound by your city and your crown, not by any shared nationhood. The land we now call Spain was a patchwork, stitched together from kingdoms and principalities, each proud of its own laws, traditions, and alliances. To the north, the Crown of Aragon controlled not just Catalonia and Valencia, but also territories in the Mediterranean, places like Sardinia, Sicily, and Naples. Aragon was outward-looking, a maritime power with its own traditions of trade, diplomacy, and law. Its people spoke Catalan, Aragonese, and a mix of other tongues, and their kings made treaties with merchants and rulers across the sea rather than with their neighbors to the west. Castile, the largest and most populous kingdom, dominated the central plateau. Its focus was more landward than seaward, more on the politics of the peninsula and the slow, grinding push against Muslim-ruled Granada in the south. The Castilian crown had its own nobility, its own coinage, and its own long history of internal struggles, noble factions who saw the king as a partner only when it suited them. And then there were the smaller realms, Navarre in the north, sometimes aligned with France, sometimes independent, the remnants of the once powerful Muslim emirate in Granada, holding on to the last sliver of Al-Andalus, and Portugal to the west, already building a reputation as a seafaring power. This was not a landscape that pointed naturally toward unity. Alliances were often sealed, not by trust, but by necessity. A marriage here, a military pact there, temporary truces between rulers who would go back to feuding within a decade. The so-called Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to retake Iberia from Muslim rule, had not been a single coordinated effort. It was a series of overlapping wars, with Christian rulers just as likely to fight each other as to fight the Emir of Granada. By the mid-15th century, Castile was facing its own troubles. Nobles resisted royal authority, rival claimants fought for the throne, and the economy was strained by warfare and by the uneven distribution of land. In Aragon, the king's influence over his Mediterranean holdings was constantly tested by local resistance and by the rising power of other states like France. Yet amid this fractured reality, a slow shift was taking place. The crowns of Europe were learning that fragmented authority made it harder to control trade, collect taxes, or maintain armies. The pressures of war and commerce were pushing rulers toward centralization, not out of idealism, but out of necessity. This is where the dull, easily overlooked details begin to matter. Standardized coinage meant that taxes could be collected in a form the crown could actually use. Consistent laws meant that merchants could trade across regions without being trapped by local customs duties or conflicting regulations. agreements over weights and measures so mundane they rarely make it into popular history, allowed grain, wool, and wine to be moved and sold more efficiently. Each of these changes was a thread, thin on its own, but together forming a fabric that could hold a larger state. The people living through these changes may not have seen them as leading toward an empire. For them, these were shifts in how their local lord collected dues, how prices were fixed in the market, or how soldiers were recruited. But over decades, these small adjustments gave rulers a kind of reach they had never had before. Religious identity was another thread, though one far more charged with emotion and conflict. By the late 15th century, Catholic monarchs saw religious unity as essential to political stability. The Muslim Emirate of Granada stood as both a military target and a symbol of unfinished conquest. Jews, long present in Iberia, were increasingly targeted by suspicion and resentment, often accused of being disloyal or of corrupting Christian society. The idea of one faith under one crown was becoming a political tool as much as a spiritual goal. Meanwhile, Portugal was showing what a small, unified state could achieve if it concentrated on maritime exploration. By the time Castile and Aragon were still settling their internal disputes, Portugal had already rounded the Cape Bojador in Africa, opened trade routes for gold and slaves, and was edging toward a sea route to India. For its Iberian neighbors, Portugal's achievements were a quiet but constant reminder. The future might belong not to those who controlled the most land, but to those who controlled the sea. It was in this world, fractured, competitive, yet slowly learning the value of cohesion, that the idea of uniting Castile and Aragon began to take on a practical appeal. And here we find one of history's great turning points disguised as something personal: a royal marriage. When Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were wed in the year 1469, it was more than a union between two young royals. It was a political merger that brought together the two largest crowns of the peninsula, and yet, calling it a merger overstates it. The two kingdoms remained legally distinct, each with its own institutions, laws, and currencies. What the marriage created was not a single state, but a single ruling couple with coordinated ambitions. That subtle difference matters. Spain, as we think of it today, did not truly exist yet, but Ferdinand and Isabella now had the leverage to coordinate military campaigns, present a united front in diplomacy, and crucially to pool resources for ventures that neither kingdom could afford alone. This fragile arrangement would become the foundation on which the Spanish Empire was built, and like so many historical foundations, it rested not on grand visions but on compromises, bureaucratic adjustments, and the slow work of persuasion. Ferdinand and Isabella had to convince their nobles to accept shared policies, their towns to agree on shared taxes, and their armies to march together. For the common people, the effects were less dramatic at first. Farmers still paid dues to local lords, markets still sold goods by the measures they had always used, and most people never saw their king or queen in person. But over time, the authority of the crown began to be felt more directly in the form of more consistent laws, more organized military levies, and a stronger hand in religious affairs. When we look back, it's tempting to say the unification of Castile and Aragon created Spain. But in truth, it only created the possibility of Spain, a possibility that still had to be tested, defended, eventually projected across the ocean. And that brings us to the real question: without this uneasy partnership, would there ever have been ships in the Atlantic carrying Spain's name toward the Americas? Or would Iberia have remained a collection of proud but competing kingdoms, watching as Portugal and others claimed the seas? When Ferdinand and Isabella stood together as husband and wife in 1469, few could have guessed that their union would alter the course of world history. To many observers, it was simply another dynastic marriage, a common enough tool in the chess game of European politics. But the timing, the personalities involved, and the pressures facing the Iberian Peninsula combined to turn this partnership into something far more consequential. Ferdinand of Aragon was a ruler, accustomed to compromise and negotiation. His kingdom was a federation of territories, each with its own customs and laws, and he had grown up understanding that power often came not from decrees but from building coalitions. Isabella of Castile, on the other hand, was heir to a kingdom accustomed to asserting dominance over vast stretches of land. Her experience was one of navigating noble factions, asserting royal authority, and enforcing order in a realm where loyalty was often conditional and fragile. Together, they formed a complementary pair. Ferdinand brought a diplomatic patience and a keen sense for balancing competing interests. Isabella brought a determination to assert control and the willingness to push through reforms that would strengthen the monarchy's position. But their combined rule was not about blending their kingdoms into one seamless whole. Instead, it was about using their joint authority to pursue shared goals, even while respecting and sometimes exploiting the differences between their realms. The first and most immediate of these goals was the conquest of Granada, the last Muslim-ruled territory in Iberia. The emirate was small compared to its former glory, but it was well defended and sustained by a network of fortresses and mountain passes. It was also rich, benefiting from trade routes that connected it to North Africa and from fertile lands in the surrounding valleys. For Ferdinand and Isabella, taking Granada was both a military necessity and a symbolic completion of the centuries-long Reconquista. This campaign would be long and costly, lasting from 1482 to 1492. It required not just soldiers but supplies, siege equipment, and a steady flow of money to keep the effort moving through winter months and difficult terrain. Here, the couple's combined resources became critical. Castile provided the bulk of the troops and financing, while Aragon contributed logistical support and experience in Mediterranean warfare. But while the war in Granada was the most visible project of their reign, Ferdinand and Isabella were also quietly reshaping the structure of their kingdoms. They worked to bring the nobility under closer royal control, creating standing councils that could advise the crown while still being firmly tied to its authority. They reformed the justice system, standardizing procedures so that royal courts could overrule local ones when necessary. They began the slow process of creating a more consistent tax system, though full uniformity would remain elusive. Religion played a central role in this consolidation of power. The monarchs secured papal approval to appoint bishops directly, giving them greater influence over the church within their realms. They also established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, a move that was as much about political control as it was about enforcing religious orthodoxy. The Inquisition allowed the crown to root out dissent and consolidate loyalty under the banner of Catholic unity. These measures were not without opposition. Some nobles resisted the erosion of their traditional privileges. Merchants in port cities like Barcelona and Valencia worried about the impact of royal policies on their trade networks. And in places like Naval, which remained outside their control, there was little appetite for being drawn into Castile and Aragon's orbit. Yet the monarchs persisted, using a mix of negotiation, strategic marriages, and, when necessary, military force to keep their authority intact. It was in this environment as Spain, becoming more centralized, more religiously uniform, and more militarily assertive, that the idea of looking beyond the familiar shores began to take hold. Ferdinand and Isabella were not the first Iberian rulers to think about exploration. Portugal had already been sending ships down the African coast for decades, seeking gold, spices, and a route to Asia that bypassed the overland paths controlled by the Ottomans. But for Castile and Aragon, expansion overseas was not yet an obvious priority. The conquest of Granada, however, was changing that. Wars are expensive, and the monarchs needed new sources of wealth to sustain their ambitions. Trade was one option, but competing with Portugal on the African route was difficult. Another possibility was to find a different path, one that avoided the established powers and opened direct access to the riches of Asia. Enter Christopher Columbus, a Genoese mariner with an unshakable belief that Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic. His idea was not entirely new, but it was bold enough to be dismissed by many experienced navigators. The distances involved were unknown, and the risks were enormous. Yet, for Isabella and Ferdinand, the proposal offered something rare: the chance to leap ahead of Portugal without directly challenging them on their well-defended southern routes. It's easy to imagine the meeting between Columbus and the monarchs as a dramatic moment of instant agreement. In reality, it was a drawn-out process of persuasion, negotiation, and delay. The monarchs were preoccupied with the war in Granada, and Columbus's demands, noble titles, a share of the profits, and governorship over any lands he discovered, seemed extravagant for a man whose plan was far from certain. Only after Granada fell in January of 1492 did the monarchs give Columbus a formal agreement. Even then, their investment was modest compared to the resources they poured into military campaigns. The expedition would consist of just 3 ships, 2 of them small caravels barely suited for long ocean crossings. It was a calculated risk if Columbus failed. The loss would be bearable. If he succeeded, the rewards could be immense. In this sense, Ferdinand and Isabella's decision was in keeping with their broader strategy. They did not gamble the stability of their realms on grand gestures. Instead, they took measured steps, building on each success and using each gain to strengthen their position. The voyage westward was not the start of Spain's empire so much as the testing of its potential. But here's where the overlooked details again become important. The same administrative reforms that allowed them to coordinate the war in Granada also made it possible to organize an overseas voyage. Standardized contracts, reliable channels for funding, and a growing network of royal agents meant that even a small fleet could be provisioned, manned, and launched without falling into chaos. The structures of empire were already being built, they just hadn't yet crossed an ocean. When Columbus sailed from Palos de la Frontera in August of 1492, he was carrying not just his own ambitions but the combined weight of Ferdinand and Isabella's new partnership. The voyage would change Spain forever, but it was only possible because of the slow, methodical groundwork laid in the years after their marriage. And so we come to the next question. If the union of these 2 crowns had not been so carefully managed, would Columbus have found anyone willing to take the risk? Or would his ships have sailed under a different flag entirely, altering the course of history before it had even begun? When the banners of Ferdinand and Isabella were raised over Granada in January of 1492, it was more than the capture of a city. It was the symbolic closing of a chapter that had been open for nearly 8 centuries. For the monarchs, it was the final stroke of the Reconquista, the moment when the last Muslim-ruled state in Iberia passed into Christian hands. But if the war had been about territory, the peace that followed was about identity. The surrender of Granada was governed by the capitulations of Santa Fe, a treaty that promised religious tolerance for the city's Muslim population. In theory, the Muslims of Granada could keep their faith, their customs, and their laws under the protection of the crown. In practice, that tolerance began to erode almost immediately. The Archbishop of Toledo and other church leaders pushed for conversions, sometimes using incentives, sometimes pressure. By the close of the 15th century, the promises of tolerance had largely been abandoned, and conversion became a matter not of persuasion but of force. This policy shift was not an isolated decision. It was part of a larger movement toward religious uniformity that had been gathering momentum throughout Ferdinand and Isabella's reign. The belief that a unified faith was necessary for a unified realm was common in Europe at the time. But in Spain, it carried a particular urgency. Centuries of coexistence between Christians, Muslims, and Jews had produced a rich, complex culture, but it had also produced deep mistrust. In moments of crisis, religious difference became a convenient explanation for political and economic problems. The Jews of Spain were the first to face the full force of this new orthodoxy. For generations, Jewish communities had been integral to the peninsula's economy, serving as financiers, artisans, translators, and physicians. They had also been the target of periodic violence and scapegoating, especially during times of plague or famine. By the late 15th century, suspicion had shifted toward those who had converted to Christianity, the so-called conversos. Many conversos rose to prominent positions in administration and commerce, but their success often fueled resentment among old Christians, who accused them of secretly practicing Judaism. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, was designed in part to address this suspicion. It was not under the control of the Pope, as other inquisitions had been, but was directly answerable to the crown. This gave Ferdinand and Isabella a powerful tool to enforce religious conformity and, by extension, political loyalty. Trials were public and often humiliating, designed as much to deter others as to punish the accused. The procedures were meticulous. Records were kept, testimonies gathered, and verdicts issued according to established protocols. The bureaucracy of faith was as precise as any in matters of trade or taxation. Then came the Edict of Expulsion in March of 1492. It gave Jews who had not converted 4 months to leave Spain, taking with them only what they could carry. Thousands sold property at a fraction of its value, often to the very neighbors who had once done business with them. Many fled to Portugal, North Africa, or the Ottoman Empire. Some attempted to return in secret, risking arrest and confiscation. For Spain, the expulsion meant the loss of a skilled and deeply rooted population. But for Ferdinand and Isabella, it was a statement. This was a realm where religion and politics were inseparable. The treatment of Muslims followed a similar trajectory. In the early years after Granada's surrender, there were attempts to govern through coexistence. Muslim leaders were left in place. Islamic law was allowed in personal matters, and mosques remained open. But mounting pressure from church authorities, combined with local uprisings and resistance, hardened royal policy. Forced conversions became common, and by the early 16th century, open practice of Islam was banned in Castile. From a modern perspective, these policies can seem both harsh and short-sighted, but to the rulers of the time, they were part of a larger strategy. Religious unity was seen as a foundation for political stability, a way to ensure that the authority of the crown would not be undermined by divided loyalties. In an era when foreign powers might support religious minorities as a means of influencing domestic politics, uniformity was a form of security. There was also an economic logic, though it was less about efficiency than control. By removing communities that operated outside the structures of Christian authority, the crown could consolidate power over land, labor, and wealth. Properties confiscated from expelled Jews and converted Muslims could be redistributed to loyal subjects, strengthening the bond between the monarchy and its supporters. The methods used to enforce this unity, inquisitions, expulsions, forced baptisms, left deep scars. They also created a precedent for how Spain would deal with cultural and religious difference in its overseas territories. When Spanish ships reached the Caribbean, Mexico, and Peru, the approach to indigenous religions was shaped by the same logic that had governed policy at home. Conversion was not optional. It was part of the process of bringing new lands under the crown's authority. Missionaries became an essential arm of empire, just as bishops and inquisitors had been at home. But while the New World offered more room for adaptation, with local traditions sometimes blended into Christian practice, the underlying principle remained the same. Unity under the Catholic faith was both a religious goal and a political necessity. This religious drive also influenced Spain's competition with other powers. The rivalry with Portugal, for instance, was not only about trade routes but about the spread of Christianity. Both kingdoms sought papal endorsement for their overseas claims, framing their voyages as crusades against non-Christian peoples. In this way, the same forces that had pushed Jews and Muslims out of Spain were now pushing Spain outward, toward the conversion and control of entire continents. It is worth pausing here to note the sheer administrative effort this required. The Inquisition was a vast institution, with networks of officials, informants, scribes, and interrogators. It produced a paper trail that filled archives, documenting every confession, every confiscated book, every punishment. This was not arbitrary rule. It was rule by procedure, and that discipline carried over into the way Spain managed its colonies. Yet, for all the order it sought to impose, the system was never without tension. Resistance took many forms: secret adherence to banned faiths, flight to more tolerant territories, or simply the quiet bending of rules in daily life. These acts rarely altered policy, but they reveal the limits of even the most centralized control. In the end, the religious transformation of Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella was both a domestic consolidation and a rehearsal for imperial rule. It showed how authority could be extended through a mix of law, bureaucracy, and the deliberate shaping of identity. It also revealed the costs in human suffering, in the loss of cultural diversity, and in the creation of divisions that would persist for centuries. And so, we face the next question. If Spain had chosen tolerance over uniformity at home, would it have built a more flexible empire abroad? Or was the very rigidity that drove people out of Iberia the same force that allowed Spain to hold distant territories together for so long? When Christopher Columbus left the port of Palos de la Frontera in August of 1492, it was not in a grand armada, but in a modest fleet of 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They were not built for transoceanic voyages. 2 were small caravels with lateen sails, more suited to coastal exploration than to the open Atlantic. The third, Columbus's flagship, was a heavier carrack, slower but capable of carrying more supplies. These were not the tools of a power certain of its reach. They were the instruments of a calculated risk. The risk was financial as well as navigational. Spain had only recently concluded the costly war in Granada. The royal treasury was stretched, and the monarchs were already committing funds to consolidating their authority at home. The money for Columbus's expedition was cobbled together from multiple sources: contributions from the crown, loans from private financiers, and even support from the town of Palos, which was ordered to provide ships as part of a royal penalty. This was not a project backed by unlimited resources. It was an experiment. The idea behind Columbus's plan was simple, in theory. By sailing west, one could reach Asia faster than by traveling around Africa. But this simplicity hid the complexity and the danger. The size of the Earth was still a matter of debate. Most navigators believed that Asia lay far beyond the western horizon, separated from Europe by an expanse of ocean too vast for the ships of the time to cross. Columbus believed otherwise, relying on calculations that underestimated the planet's circumference by thousands of miles. The voyage began with fair winds, carrying the fleet steadily westward into waters few Europeans had seen. As the days passed and no land appeared, tension grew. The crew, drawn from different parts of Spain and beyond, began to doubt both the plan and the man who had convinced them to follow it. Columbus kept 2 sets of logs, one accurate, the other understated, to reassure his men that they had traveled less distance from home than they actually had. It was a small act of manipulation, but one that may have kept the expedition from turning back. After more than a month at sea, the first signs of land appeared: drifting vegetation, carved sticks, and birds flying west. On the night of October 11th, a sailor aboard the Pinta sighted a faint outline on the horizon. By morning, the ships anchored off the shores of an island in what is now the Bahamas. Columbus believed he had reached the outer islands of Asia. He was wrong, but his mistake would shape the next 4 centuries of history. The first encounters with the island's inhabitants were cautious. Columbus described them in his journal as friendly and generous, noting their lack of iron and weapons. To the Spanish, this was evidence of both innocence and vulnerability. Gifts were exchanged, but the imbalance of power was already clear. The Spanish carried steel swords and wore armor. The islanders had spears tipped with fishbone. Columbus explored further, visiting other islands in the Bahamas, and then sailing to Cuba and Hispaniola. At each stop, he planted a flag and claimed the land for the Spanish crown. These acts were formalities under European law, but to the people already living there, they marked the arrival of a new and disruptive force. The voyage was not without setbacks. On Christmas Day, the Santa Maria ran aground on the coast of Hispaniola and could not be salvaged. Columbus used its timbers to build a small settlement, La Navidad, leaving behind a garrison of 39 men when he set sail for Spain in January of 1493. He carried with him samples of gold, exotic plants, and a handful of indigenous people, evidence to present at court of the voyage's success. When Columbus returned to Spain, the reception was extraordinary. The monarchs received him in Barcelona with honors, treating him as the discoverer of a new route to Asia. The details of his mistake, that he had found lands unknown to Europe rather than the fringes of Asia, were not yet clear. What mattered was the potential for wealth, territory, and conversion. The success of the first voyage set in motion a chain of events that would transform Spain from a regional power into a global empire. Columbus was given funds for a second, much larger expedition. This time, he sailed with 17 ships and more than 1,000 men, soldiers, settlers, priests, and craftsmen. The mission was no longer one of exploration alone, it was the beginning of colonization. La Navidad was found destroyed upon their arrival, the men killed in conflicts with local inhabitants. The Spanish response was swift and harsh, setting a tone for future interactions. Settlements were rebuilt, and the search for gold intensified. Columbus began to impose systems of labor on the indigenous population, compelling them to mine and gather resources. The patterns of exploitation that would define much of Spain's rule in the Americas were already taking shape. Yet it is important to see these early voyages not as the work of a fully formed empire, but as steps in a process. The Spanish crown still had to decide how to govern these distant lands, how to divide authority between explorers and administrators, and how to integrate the flow of resources into its broader economy. Each voyage brought not just treasure, but administrative challenges, keeping ships supplied, managing relations with indigenous peoples, and ensuring that the benefits outweighed the costs. Portugal's reaction added another layer of complexity. The Portuguese crown, seeing Spain's sudden advantage, appealed to the Pope, claiming that the new lands fell within their sphere of influence under earlier agreements. This dispute led to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the non-European world between the two powers along a line running through the Atlantic. Spain would claim lands to the west of the line, Portugal to the east. This arrangement, negotiated thousands of miles from the territories it affected, would shape the map for centuries. Columbus himself would make 4 voyages in total, each revealing more of the Caribbean and parts of Central and South America. He never set foot on the mainland of North America, and he died still believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia. But the opening he created allowed others to follow: conquistadors, settlers, missionaries, and administrators, each carrying with them the structures of Spanish governance and the expectations of Spanish authority. From the perspective of the crown, the real success of Columbus's gamble was not in his personal discoveries, but in proving that a transatlantic crossing was possible and repeatable. Once the route was established, it could be refined, secured, and expanded. Ships could carry not just explorers but supplies, soldiers, and, eventually, vast quantities of silver and gold. This was the beginning of Spain's transformation into a maritime empire. The skills that had unified Castile and Aragon bureaucratic organization, control over religious life, and the ability to mobilize resources for long campaigns were now applied on a new stage. The ocean was no longer a barrier but a bridge, connecting the Iberian Peninsula to lands and peoples it had never known. And so we arrive at a turning point, the moment when Spain had to decide whether these new territories were to be temporary outposts or permanent possessions. Would the crown treat them as distant markets, visited and traded with occasionally, or as integral parts of a realm that spanned half the globe? By the first years of the 16th century, it was becoming clear to sailors, merchants, and the Spanish crown that Columbus's islands were not the gateway to Asia. The further navigators pushed, the more they encountered not spices and silk but unfamiliar coastlines and cultures. Yet the appetite for expansion had already been awakened. The logic was simple enough. Even if these were not the riches of the East, they were lands that could be claimed, converted, and made to yield resources. The challenge was navigation. Ships of the period had improved in design, with stronger hulls and more flexible rigging, but long voyages remained unpredictable. Storms could scatter fleets. Currents could drag a ship hundreds of miles off course. The mariner's compass gave direction but not position. Latitude could be estimated by the sun's height, but longitude remained a mystery without precise timekeeping, a problem that would not be solved for centuries. Voyages therefore required not only skill but a willingness to accept uncertainty. This uncertainty was not purely geographic. Even as explorers like Vicente Yáñez Pinzón and Juan de la Cosa charted new stretches of coastline, there was debate in Spain about what these discoveries meant. Were they part of Asia, a separate continent, or a chain of islands without end? These questions mattered because they influenced the crown's strategy. If these lands were near Asia, they could be stepping stones to the spice trade. If not, they had to be valued for their own resources: timber, dyes, sugar, and gold. It was in this climate of confusion and opportunity that Vasco Núñez de Balboa made his way to the Isthmus of Panama. Balboa was not an aristocrat backed by royal favor, but an adventurer who had escaped debt in Spain by stowing away on a ship. In the new settlements along the Caribbean coast, he found his place as a leader among men who were willing to endure hardship for the chance at wealth. In 1513, hearing from indigenous allies that another great sea lay to the west, Balboa led a small expedition across the narrow strip of land. The crossing was grueling dense jungle, steep hills, swamps alive with insects. Many of the Spaniards had little experience in such terrain, and they relied heavily on indigenous guides to find their way. After weeks of effort, they reached a ridge from which they could see the vast expanse of water we now know as the Pacific Ocean. Balboa waded into the surf and claimed the ocean and all its shores for the Spanish crown, naming it the Mar del Sur, the South Sea. The act was ceremonial, yet it carried immense consequences. It suggested that the lands Columbus had reached were not the end of the journey, but a barrier between two great oceans. To cross from one to the other would require more than navigation. It would require control over land routes and cooperation or conquest of the people who lived there. While Balboa was making his discovery, others were pushing the limits of exploration at sea. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese sailor in the service of Spain, set out to find a western route to Asia by sailing around the southern tip of the new continent. His expedition was far larger and more ambitious than Columbus's first voyage. Equipped with 5 ships and over 200 men, the journey was brutal. The fleet hugged the South American coast for months, searching for a passage through to the ocean Balboa had seen. Food ran short, and tempers frayed. The passage, when they finally found it, was a narrow, twisting channel battered by winds, the strait that now bears Magellan's name. The Pacific beyond was calm in comparison, but the distances were vast. Crossing from South America to Asia took months without landfall. Men died of scurvy, their bodies weakened by lack of fresh food. Magellan himself did not survive the voyage, killed in the Philippines in a conflict with local forces. Yet one ship, the Victoria, completed the circumnavigation of the globe in 1522, returning to Spain with a small cargo of valuable spices. The expedition proved beyond doubt that the earth could be sailed around, and that the lands Columbus had reached were not part of Asia. It also revealed the scale of Spain's task if it wished to dominate global trade, control of both oceans, and the routes between them. Back in the Americas, settlements were expanding. The crown began to send not just explorers but administrators and clergy. Towns were laid out according to a grid, following the laws of the Indies, which prescribed everything from the placement of the central plaza to the width of streets. This was empire by regulation as much as by sword. Each new settlement was a node in a growing network of Spanish authority, connected by ships carrying orders, supplies, and people in both directions. These towns were fragile, food shortages were common, and relations with indigenous communities were often tense or openly hostile. Survival depended on a mix of force and negotiation. Alliances were made with some groups to fight others. Marriages were arranged to secure cooperation. Catholic missions were established to convert and educate, though conversion was often tied to labor demands. The encomienda system, granting Spaniards the right to extract labor and tribute from indigenous people in exchange for protection and Christian teaching, became a defining and deeply exploitative feature of Spanish rule. The crown was aware of the potential for abuse, but also dependent on the system to sustain its colonies. Royal officials issued decrees urging fair treatment, but enforcement was weak, especially in distant settlements where local leaders acted with autonomy. Reports of cruelty reached Spain, sparking debates that would continue for decades over the morality and legality of conquest. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas argued passionately for the rights of indigenous peoples, while others defended the expeditions as a means of spreading Christianity and civilization. In these years, Spain's expansion was still experimental. Routes were being mapped, administrative systems tested, and claims staked in anticipation of future rivals. Portugal remained the most immediate competitor, but France and England were beginning to send their own ships across the Atlantic. The race was not yet for half the world, but for the right to decide what that world would look like. And so, in these early decades, the Spanish Empire took shape in a haze of incomplete knowledge, personal ambition, and practical necessity. No single plan dictated its growth. It was the accumulation of voyages, settlements, and encounters, each one building on the last, each one shaped by the people, Spaniard and indigenous alike, who had to make life possible in unfamiliar lands. The question was no longer whether Spain would claim new territories, but whether it could hold them, govern them, and extract from them enough wealth to justify the risks and costs. And as we will see, the answer to that question would depend not just on daring captains or royal decrees, but on the slow, often unseen work of building a system that could span oceans. By the spring of 1519, Hernán Cortés stood on the sandy shore of what is now Veracruz, looking inland toward mountains that rose like distant walls. He had arrived not as a lone explorer, but as the leader of a force numbering around 500 men, a handful of horses, and a few small cannons. It was not an army in the European sense, but in the New World, where horses had not been seen for centuries, and steel armor flashed in the sun. Such a force carried the weight of intimidation. Cortés had not been sent with royal approval to launch a grand conquest. His orders were more limited, to explore, trade, and secure Spain's foothold in these lands. But his ambitions exceeded his commission. The rumors that had reached the Caribbean told of a vast and wealthy empire inland, with cities of stone, markets overflowing with goods, and rulers who commanded thousands. If true, this was the kind of opportunity that could transform a man's fortune and legacy. From the beginning, the campaign relied not only on Spanish weaponry, but on diplomacy, or more accurately, on opportunistic alliance building. The first encounters along the coast were with the Totonac people, who were subject to tribute demands from the Aztec Empire. Cortés offered them a partnership, Spanish steel and firepower in exchange for local support against the Aztecs. It was a bargain rooted in mutual need, and it would set the pattern for much of the conquest. Language was a barrier, but it was overcome in a way that would shape the expedition's success. Among the people given to Cortés as part of a diplomatic exchange was a woman later known to history as Malintzin, or La Malinche. She spoke both Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and the Maya tongue, which one of Cortés's interpreters also knew. Through this chain of translation, messages could pass between Spaniards and the peoples they encountered. Over time, Malintzin became more than a translator. She was a cultural mediator, advising Cortés on political dynamics and negotiating terms that kept the expedition moving forward. The march inland was slow. Roads were not the broad avenues of Europe, but footpaths through varied terrain, coastal plains, forested hills, and high plateaus. Supplies had to be carried by porters, and every night camp had to be secured. Food came partly from local allies and partly from foraging, though shortages were common. The Spaniards' armor grew heavier in the heat, and their boots wore through on rough ground. In Tlaxcala, a confederation that had long resisted Aztec domination, the Spaniards faced one of their most serious battles. The Tlaxcalans fought fiercely, and for days the fighting was close and brutal, with spears and arrows clattering off shields and armor. Yet when the conflict ended, the Tlaxcalans saw an opportunity in alliance. They brought food, warriors, and knowledge of the Aztec heartland, strengthening Cortés's force for the next stage of the campaign. The approach to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was like nothing the Spaniards had seen before. After crossing the mountain passes, they descended into the Valley of Mexico, where a shimmering lake reflected the sky. In the middle of this lake rose a city linked to the shore by long causeways. Whitewashed buildings, towering temples, and bustling markets marked it as a seat of power and culture. It was larger than most European cities of the time, home to perhaps 200,000 people. Cortés was received by Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor, with a mix of ceremony and wariness. The reasons for Moctezuma's initial welcome remain debated. Some suggest he saw the Spaniards as potential allies against internal rivals, others that he sought to keep them under watch. Whatever the motive, the meeting was an exchange of gifts and courtesies, though beneath the surface each side was measuring the other's strength. Inside the city, the Spaniards were both awed and uneasy. The markets offered goods from across the empire: cacao, textiles, obsidian tools, and foods unknown in Europe. The temples rose high above the streets, and the ritual life of the city was visible in public ceremonies. Yet they were strangers surrounded by tens of thousands, dependent on Moctezuma's hospitality. Cortés made a bold move. He took the emperor into what was essentially house arrest, claiming it was for his safety. This gave the Spaniards leverage, but it also deepened tensions. Back on the coast, events were unfolding that threatened Cortés's position. A Spanish force sent by the governor of Cuba arrived to arrest him for exceeding his orders. Leaving a garrison in Tenochtitlan, Cortés marched to confront and defeat this new threat, and then convinced many of the defeated soldiers to join him. But in his absence, resentment in the city boiled over. When he returned, the garrison was under siege, and the streets were hostile. What followed was a chaotic retreat, known as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The Spaniards and their allies tried to escape along the causeways under cover of darkness, but they were discovered. Arrows, spears, and stones rained down, and many Spaniards fell into the water, dragged down by the weight of their armor. Horses and cannon were lost, and the survivors limped back to Tlaxcala to recover. It might have ended there, but Cortés regrouped. With Tlaxcalan allies and reinforcements from the coast, he returned to lay siege to Tenochtitlan. This time the campaign was systematic. The lake was blockaded by brigantines, small ships built on site, and the causeways were taken section by section. Food supplies into the city were cut off, and disease, likely smallpox introduced earlier by Europeans, swept through the population. After months of fighting, the city fell in August 1521. The victory was devastating in its cost. Large parts of Tenochtitlan lay in ruins, and the population had been reduced by hunger and disease. Yet from the Spanish perspective, the conquest was complete. They now controlled the heart of a wealthy and populous region, with access to tribute, labor, and resources that would sustain further expansion. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not just a military victory, it marked a shift in the nature of Spain's presence in the Americas. No longer were they confined to coastal settlements. They had taken an inland empire, and with it came the challenge of ruling millions of people. Roads were repaired, churches were built, and Spanish authority was imposed through both force and administration. The city was rebuilt as Mexico City, becoming the administrative center of New Spain. Yet the victory also set precedents that would echo across the empire. Spain's conquests would often rely on alliances with discontented local groups, on exploiting existing rivalries, and on combining military force with political maneuvering. And each victory brought not only wealth, but the need to govern diverse and often resistant populations. The question that now loomed was whether this model could be repeated elsewhere, and whether the next great empire to be encountered would fall as the Aztecs had. By the early 1530s, the Spanish crown had already seen the staggering returns from Mexico, gold, silver, and agricultural tribute flowing steadily back across the Atlantic. It was enough to make every ambitious man in the Caribbean look south toward rumors of another empire, one said to be rich in precious metals and stretched across mountains higher than anything in Spain. Francisco Pizarro, already a veteran of expeditions along the Pacific coast, had heard these tales and believed they pointed toward a land worth risking everything to reach. Pizarro was not young by the time he set out. Born into relative obscurity in Trujillo, Spain, he had spent years in the Americas, learning the patience and ruthlessness that the frontier demanded. His early attempts to penetrate the lands to the south had failed. Hunger, storms, and hostile encounters had driven his small forces back. But in 1531, he secured royal permission for another attempt. This time, his objectives were explicit: explore, claim territory in the name of the crown, and if possible, bring this rumored kingdom under Spanish rule. The Inca Empire he approached was not in its prime. Civil war had recently torn it apart. Two brothers, Atahualpa and Huascar, had fought for the throne after the death of their father, Huayna Capac, likely from a disease introduced by earlier European contact. Atahualpa had emerged victorious, but his control was fresh and fragile. The empire itself stretched from present-day Colombia to Chile, connected by roads that wound through mountain passes and supported by storehouses of food and supplies. It was a system built for stability, but in this moment, it was vulnerable. Pizarro's first contact with the Inca court came at the town of Cajamarca, high in the Andes. The Spanish force numbered fewer than 200 men, but they carried steel swords, pikes, muskets, and perhaps most importantly, a small number of horses. To the Inca, who had never seen horses or riders in armor, these animals were as unsettling as they were unfamiliar. Pizarro understood this psychological edge and planned to use it. The meeting was arranged in the central plaza. Atahualpa arrived with thousands of retainers, his presence marked by banners, music, and ritual. He sat on a low throne, carried on the shoulders of attendants, dressed in rich fabrics and adorned with gold. The Spaniards, hidden in surrounding buildings, waited for Pizarro's signal. When it came, the quiet plaza exploded into chaos. Cannons fired, muskets cracked, and cavalry charged into the crowd. The noise and smoke disoriented the Inca soldiers, who were unarmed for what they believed was a ceremonial meeting. The attack was brief but decisive. Atahualpa was taken captive, and in the confusion, thousands of his followers were killed or scattered. For the Spanish, this was more than a tactical victory. It gave them control over the person of the emperor, the symbolic center of Inca authority. From captivity, Atahualpa sought to secure his release. He promised to fill a room with gold and twice over with silver in exchange for his freedom. The Spaniards agreed, and over the following months, treasure from across the empire was brought to Cajamarca, not as coins, for the Inca had no currency, but as ceremonial objects, jewelry, and temple adornments. These were melted down into ingots for transport, destroying centuries of artistry in the process. Yet once the ransom was paid, the Spaniards did not release Atahualpa. They feared that freeing him would reignite resistance and that his continued rule could undermine their growing control. In August 1533, after a hasty trial on charges of treason and idolatry, Atahualpa was executed, first strangled and then, according to some accounts, his body burned. The act removed the head of the empire, but left its limbs still capable of striking back. The march to Cuzco, the Inca capital, was not without resistance. Local lords, seeing an opportunity to advance their own positions, sometimes aided the Spaniards with supplies or guides. Others fought fiercely, using their knowledge of the terrain to launch ambushes. The Andes were a punishing environment. High passes brought thin air, freezing nights, and trails so narrow that horses could barely pass. But the Spanish push was steady, bolstered by native allies, and the demoralization caused by disease. When Cuzco fell in 1533, the Spanish saw it not just as the capture of a city, but as the seizure of an empire's heart. Temples were stripped of gold, administrative buildings were repurposed, and the symbols of Inca authority were replaced with those of the crown and the church. Pizarro set about installing a puppet ruler, Manco Inca, hoping to govern through him while consolidating Spanish settlements along the coast. Yet this arrangement proved unstable. Manco Inca, initially cooperative, grew resentful of Spanish demands and abuses. In 1536, he escaped Cuzco and rallied a massive force to lay siege to the city. For months, the Spaniards were trapped, relying on dwindling supplies and desperate sallies to keep the attackers at bay. The siege eventually broke, but it showed that the conquest was far from secure. Manco Inca withdrew into the remote Vilcabamba region, establishing a small but enduring resistance. For decades, this neo-Inca state challenged Spanish control, launching raids and maintaining a symbolic continuity of the empire. It was not until 1572 that Vilcabamba fell, marking the final collapse of organized Inca resistance. The Spanish foothold in Peru transformed quickly into a center of wealth. Silver mines at Potosí, discovered in 1545, produced a flow of bullion so vast that it reshaped economies on both sides of the Atlantic. Indigenous labor, drafted under the meter system, a colonial adaptation of an Inca labor tax, kept the mines running, often at terrible human cost. High-altitude cold, mercury poisoning from refining, and grueling shifts made mining one of the deadliest occupations in the empire. This wealth fueled Spain's global reach, but also sowed the seeds of future challenges. Inflation in Europe, competition from other colonial powers, and the logistical strains of governing territories separated by oceans all tested the durability of Spanish dominance. Yet, in the immediate aftermath of Pizarro's campaigns, the pattern seemed clear. Small, determined Spanish forces, leveraging local divisions, could dismantle vast indigenous states. It is easy, looking back, to see inevitability in this. But for those living through it, Inca generals plotting in mountain valleys, Spanish soldiers nursing wounds in Cuzco's plazas, families in highland villages deciding whether to resist or cooperate, nothing felt certain. The mountains still held their secrets, the roads still carried news faster than Spanish messengers could ride, and the balance of power could shift with a single betrayal or a sudden outbreak of disease. The question then became not whether Spain could take such an empire, but how long it could hold it and at what cost to those who lived in its shadow. When you picture Spain's empire, you might think of the Caribbean, Mexico, or Peru. But by the mid-16th century, the crown's gaze was fixed far beyond the Americas. Across the Pacific lay islands rumored to be rich in spices, silks, and porcelain goods that could be sold in Europe at prices high enough to change the fortunes of entire cities. Reaching them directly would mean bypassing the Portuguese, who controlled the main routes through the Indian Ocean. This was not just about exploration. It was about breaking into a lucrative network of trade already centuries old. The first step was not an expedition from Spain itself. but from its American colonies. The Pacific crossing had been attempted before, most famously by Ferdinand Magellan's voyage in 1519. Magellan never completed the trip, dying in the Philippines, but his surviving crew proved that the Pacific could be crossed. For decades after, Spanish efforts to return were sporadic, hampered by the difficulty of sailing east across an ocean where winds and currents seemed to work against them. The key would be finding a reliable return route, the tornaviaje. It was Andres de Urdaneta, a former soldier turned Augustinian friar, who solved this puzzle in 1565. Sailing with Miguel López de Legazpi from Mexico to the Philippines, he charted a northern route home, riding the westerly winds back to the Americas. This single discovery made regular crossings possible. It was the kind of logistical breakthrough, less glamorous than battles or gold, but just as crucial, that underpinned the growth of empires. Legazpi established a permanent Spanish settlement in Cebu, later moving the colonial capital to Manila in 1571. Manila's location was strategic, a sheltered bay with access to Chinese trading networks and within reach of the Spice Islands. Almost immediately, the city became a hub where goods from across Asia were gathered for shipment to the Americas. Here is where the Manila galleon trade began, a system that would operate for more than 2 centuries. Once a year, massive galleons would sail from Manila to Acapulco in present-day Mexico, carrying silk, porcelain, ivory, and spices. The return trip brought Mexican silver, which was in high demand in China. This was not just a trade route, it was a bridge connecting economies and cultures on opposite sides of the world. The Spanish presence in the Philippines was not uncontested. Indigenous polities, Muslim sultanates in Mindanao and Sulu, and Chinese traders all had their own interests. Early Spanish governors found themselves relying heavily on alliances with local rulers, Catholic missionaries, and the small but growing population of Spanish settlers. Fortifications were built, not only to defend against local resistance, but also to ward off other European powers, especially the Dutch and the English, who eyed the trade route as a tempting target. Missionary activity was a constant feature of Spanish rule. Augustinians, Franciscans, Jesuits, and Dominicans each took responsibility for certain regions, learning local languages and attempting to convert communities to Christianity. In many cases, conversion was gradual, blending Catholic practices with indigenous traditions. Churches built of coral, stone, and wood appeared in coastal towns, often doubling as centers of administration and refuge during raids. These raids were not always from rival powers. The Moro Wars, a long-running conflict with Muslim communities in the southern Philippines, shaped much of the colonial military policy. Spanish garrisons, often staffed by Mexican and Peruvian soldiers, fought in campaigns that were as much about controlling trade and territory as about religion. The conflict drained resources but never fully subdued the southern sultanates, which remained outside effective Spanish control well into the 19th century. Daily life in Manila was a mosaic of cultures. Alongside Spanish officials and friars were Chinese merchants in the Parian, a segregated quarter outside the city walls. These traders supplied goods, artisanship, and connections to markets in Fujian and beyond. There were also Japanese Christians fleeing persecution, Mexican soldiers stationed far from home, and Filipino communities whose lives now revolved around both subsistence farming and tribute obligations to the colonial government. The Manila galleons themselves were feats of endurance and seamanship. Built in Mexican shipyards, they were among the largest vessels of their time, sometimes carrying more than 2,000 tons of cargo. Crews faced months at sea, cramped conditions, and the constant threat of storms, scurvy, and pirate attacks. A single successful voyage could yield enormous profits, but a ship lost to weather or enemy action could ruin investors and damage the colonial treasury. The silver flowing into Manila from the Americas also had far-reaching effects. In China, it became a key medium for paying taxes and conducting trade, fueling the Ming economy. In Europe, it contributed to Spain's wealth, but also to inflation, a phenomenon sometimes called the price revolution. This interconnectedness meant that events in one part of the world, a bad harvest in Mexico, a storm in the Pacific, political unrest in China could ripple across continents. Over time, Spanish influence spread through the archipelago, though it was always uneven. Some regions came under firm control, integrated into colonial administration and religious structures. Others remained autonomous, resisting through open conflict or simply by retreating into remote interiors where Spanish presence was minimal. This patchwork control was a reality of empire. Maps in Madrid might show bold lines enclosing territory, but the lived experience on the ground was far more complex. The Philippines also served as a strategic link in Spain's broader imperial system. Supplies from Mexico supported its garrisons, and ships from Manila carried intelligence about Asian politics, European rivalries, and trade trends. At the same time, the colony's dependence on the galleon trade made it vulnerable. A disruption in this annual voyage could cause shortages, unrest, and financial strain. By the 17th century, the Manila connection had become routine, almost predictable in its rhythm. Yet beneath this stability was a constant undercurrent of fragility. Storms could sink a ship, wars could close markets, or a single mutiny could alter the flow of goods. The empire's reach across the Pacific was an extraordinary achievement of navigation and logistics, but it rested on delicate balances of diplomacy, commerce, and endurance. Standing on the walls of Intramuros in Manila, a Spanish soldier could look out over a harbor crowded with junks, galleons, and small coastal craft, knowing that the fortunes of the empire ran through this single port. The air smelled of spices, tar, and the sea. The streets outside the gates were alive with the clamor of merchants and porters speaking half a dozen languages. Here, on the far edge of Spain's world, the threads of Europe, the Americas, and Asia were tied together, but always with knots that could be loosened by time, conflict, or neglect. It leaves us wondering, how did this far-flung connection hold for so long, and what finally began to unravel it? By the mid-16th century, Spain had become the preeminent power in Europe, its reach spanning the Americas, the Pacific, and outposts in Africa and Asia. Gold and silver from the Americas fueled not just the crown's ambitions, but the opulent lifestyles of kings, nobles, and courtiers. Cities like Madrid, Seville, and Toledo glimmered with wealth. Yet beneath the surface, Spain's position was precarious. The empire was vast, complex, and expensive to maintain, and Europe remained a cauldron of rivalries, religion, and dynastic ambition. The Spanish crown, now ruling as a composite monarchy over Castile, Aragon, and the Habsburg territories in Italy and the Low Countries, faced constant military demands. The 30 Years' War was still decades away, but by the 16th century, conflicts with France, the Ottoman Empire, and Protestant states in northern Europe were already draining resources. Every campaign required troops, artillery, transport, and provisions, often supplied from distant colonies. The same silver that built palaces also funded armies marching across Europe. Religion was inseparable from politics. Spain saw itself as the defender of Catholic Christendom, a mission reinforced by the crown's alliance with the papacy. Wars against Protestant regions, the Ottoman navy, and rebellious cities were framed not just as territorial disputes but as moral obligations. Yet the cost was staggering. Soldiers needed pay, ships needed maintenance, and prolonged sieges sapped both manpower and morale. Venice and the Low Countries, though smaller than Spain, demonstrated that money and skill could blunt even the mightiest powers. One of the most famous confrontations came in 1588, when the Spanish Armada set sail to invade England. This was the culmination of decades of religious and dynastic tension. Philip II, the Spanish king, sought to depose Elizabeth I, suppress Protestantism, and secure control over the English Channel. The fleet, composed of more than 100 ships and tens of thousands of men, was the largest ever assembled at the time. Its failure became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even immense resources could be undone by weather, miscommunication, and determined opposition. Spain's European entanglements had consequences for its colonies. Maintaining garrisons, transporting silver, and protecting trade routes required constant vigilance. Pirates, privateers, and rival powers threatened shipping. In the Caribbean, English and Dutch ships raided ports and captured treasure. On the Pacific, storms and navigation errors could sink galleons, cutting off Manila from supplies. Every distant victory in Europe or the Americas had to be paid for, often in lives, gold, and the labor of indigenous people. Internally, the empire faced the challenge of administration. Governing multiple territories separated by oceans demanded a sophisticated bureaucracy. Royal councils, viceroys, and governors attempted to enforce laws and collect taxes, yet delays were inevitable. Messages could take months to cross the Atlantic or the Pacific. Decisions made in Madrid might arrive too late, ill-suited for local conditions. To compensate, local officials often exercised autonomy, blending official policies with practical improvisation. This mix of centralized authority and local flexibility allowed Spain to govern a vast realm but also created opportunities for corruption and inefficiency. Economics shaped much of Spain's policy. The inflow of silver encouraged spending and investment in wars, palaces, and luxuries. But it also caused inflation in Europe, reducing the purchasing power of ordinary Spaniards. Agriculture, crafts, and industry in Spain itself lagged behind the colony's wealth. Dependence on imported bullion made the empire vulnerable. If shipments were delayed or lost, the crown's ability to wage war or maintain administration faltered. Cultural and religious consolidation were intertwined with imperial expansion. The crown promoted the Catholic faith vigorously, establishing dioceses and missions in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Religious orders oversaw education, conversion, and administration, often becoming de facto managers of resources and populations. The Inquisition extended its influence overseas, monitoring morality, orthodoxy, and loyalty. These measures reinforced the crown's authority, but also created tensions with local populations, settlers, and even colonial officials who sought practical compromises. The empire's scale also amplified communication challenges. Orders from the king were interpreted, modified, or delayed by layers of bureaucracy. A decree in Spain could be enforced differently in Mexico, Peru, or Manila. Governors relied on local networks, indigenous intermediaries, and the clergy to maintain stability. Mistakes, misunderstandings, or delays often led to uprisings, disputes over land, or conflicts with indigenous rulers who had agreed to alliances under earlier assumptions. Spain's rivals watched carefully. France, England, and the Dutch Republic each posed threats, seeking to capture colonies, disrupt trade, or assert influence. Naval power became a central concern. Coastal fortifications, fleets of galleons, and convoy systems were developed to protect treasure fleets and colonies. These measures were effective but costly, requiring constant investment in shipbuilding, maintenance, and skilled sailors. The logistics alone, moving men, food, cannon, and supplies across oceans, was staggering. Meanwhile, on the ground in the colonies, Spanish officials faced day-to-day challenges. Indigenous populations were often reduced by disease and forced labor, creating labor shortages and social disruption. Settlers struggled to grow crops, mine silver, and maintain towns far from European supplies. Missions sought to convert local populations, but cultural differences, language barriers, and resistance complicated their work. Every success depended on coordination, persistence, and, often, coercion. By the end of the 16th century, Spain's power seemed almost unassailable. It controlled vast territories, commanded enormous resources, and had networks stretching from Europe to the Americas to Asia. Yet the costs were accumulating invisibly. The crown's debt grew with every war. Inflation undermined domestic stability, colonies became increasingly difficult to manage. Wealth alone could not solve the challenges of distance, diversity, and complexity. The empire's expansion also had unforeseen consequences for Europe. The influx of American silver fueled economies, but also contributed to social tensions, shifts in trade patterns, and the rise of other powers who learned to exploit Spain's preoccupation with global governance. Military overreach, reliance on borrowed money, and the expectation that colonies would supply endless resources set the stage for long-term vulnerabilities. Spain's European wars, costly as they were, reflected a larger reality. An empire stretching across continents could not be defended solely by ships and soldiers. Political strategy, alliances, diplomacy, and administration became as vital as battlefield prowess. Spain's global position was a balancing act. One misstep could expose weaknesses to rivals, uprisings, or economic crises. It leaves us asking, could Spain maintain dominance over such a vast and diverse empire indefinitely, or were the very structures that allowed it to expand also the seeds of future decline? Imagine walking through a town in New Spain in the early 17th century. You might be in Mexico City, with its broad plazas, whitewashed buildings, and bustling markets. Or in a smaller outpost high in the Andes, where narrow streets wind past adobe houses and stone churches. Life in these towns was shaped by a mixture of European planning, local geography, and the demands of colonial authority. Roads, plazas, and administrative buildings followed the crown's prescriptions, but the real experience of life was far more irregular, improvised, and dependent on human endurance. At the center of colonial towns was often the Plaza Mayor. Here, government buildings and the church framed open space used for markets, ceremonies, and public announcements. Soldiers patrolled, merchants sold goods, and townspeople gathered for news, gossip, and business. The plaza was both a social hub and a mechanism of control. Parades, festivals, and punishments reminded residents that the crown's authority reached into daily life. Yet, beneath this order, human improvisation thrived. Street vendors adjusted to the rhythms of travel and trade. Children played in alleys, and families maintained gardens, animals, or workshops behind their homes. Colonial society was deeply hierarchical. At the top were Spanish-born elites, the peninsulares, who held key administrative, military, and ecclesiastical positions. Below them were the criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, often wealthy but sometimes frustrated by their exclusion from the highest offices. Mixed-race populations, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans filled the rest of the social spectrum. Each group had defined roles, but movement between them was possible through wealth, marriage, or religious status, though rare. Laws codified distinctions, but enforcement depended on local conditions. Indigenous communities, while formerly under Spanish authority, often retained aspects of their pre-colonial organization. Local leaders could collect tribute and oversee labor, sometimes negotiating with Spanish officials to maintain autonomy. In rural areas, villages might continue traditional agriculture, combining European crops like wheat with native maize, potatoes, or beans. Festivals blended Catholic saints' days with older rituals, producing a hybrid cultural landscape that reflected adaptation, resistance, and survival. Labor systems were central to colonial life. The encomienda granted Spaniards the right to extract labor and tribute from indigenous communities, theoretically in exchange for protection and religious instruction. In practice, it often amounted to forced labor on farms, in mines, or on infrastructure projects. Later, the repartimiento and mita systems redistributed labor more formally, particularly for mining operations in Peru. Working conditions were harsh, diseases spread rapidly, and survival depended on local knowledge, skill, and networks of mutual aid. Mining towns were microcosms of empire. Potosí, discovered in 1545, grew into a city of tens of thousands almost overnight. The Cerro Rico, the rich silver mountain, demanded constant labor, and the mountain itself became a place of immense human suffering. Miners worked in cold, high-altitude conditions, often exposed to mercury during refining. Death and injury were constant companions. Yet the city thrived economically, with merchants, artisans, and officials creating a bustling urban life around the mines. Silver from Potosi fueled trade networks that reached Manila, Seville, and beyond, linking the labor of ordinary people to global flows of wealth. Urban centers also had complex social and cultural life. Markets offered foods, textiles, and tools from local and foreign sources. Festivals combined Spanish religious practices with indigenous or African elements, producing dances, music, and processions unique to the colonies. Churches served not just for worship but as centers of education, dispute resolution, and community gatherings. Within these spaces, ordinary people navigated authority, negotiated resources, and built lives under colonial oversight. Families lived in multi-generational households. Homes were modest, constructed of adobe, stone, or timber depending on local resources. Cooking was done over open fires or clay stoves, with diets blending European, indigenous, and African ingredients. Clothing followed social norms, but practicality often overrode fashion, especially for laborers or those living in remote areas. Hygiene, health, and mortality shaped daily routines, with births, marriages, and deaths accompanied by religious rituals that reinforced both spiritual and social order. Trade and transport were lifelines. Roads, bridges, and waterways allowed movement of goods, people, and information. Pack animals, mules, llamas, horses carried supplies over mountains and plains. Merchants and artisans adapted to the rhythms of supply and demand, often relying on informal networks to obtain scarce goods. Communication could take weeks or months, so local decisions were often improvised, balancing the crown's expectations with immediate realities. Religion infused every aspect of life. Catholic observances structured the calendar, provided moral guidance, and offered explanations for misfortune. Missionaries taught reading, writing, and religious doctrine, while also recording local customs, producing invaluable historical records. Syncretism emerged as indigenous and African beliefs blended with Catholic practices, resulting in rituals, imagery, and festivals that were both familiar and new to the participants. Education, though limited, was present in urban centers and mission schools. Children of Spanish descent had access to formal instruction, while indigenous elites could sometimes learn reading, writing, and theology. Knowledge of multiple languages was essential. Spanish, Nahuatl, Quechua, and other local tongues allowed officials, traders, and clergy to communicate and maintain influence. Literacy was a tool of both control and empowerment, connecting local populations to imperial governance. Conflict, both subtle and overt, was an everyday reality. Indigenous revolts, resistance to labor demands, disputes among settlers, and piracy along coasts required vigilance. Local authorities mediated disputes using a combination of legal codes, customary law, and practical negotiation. The Spanish crown relied on reports from local officials to understand conditions, but these often arrived late, filtered through layers of bureaucracy. Adaptation and improvisation were therefore essential for survival. Health and disease were central forces shaping life. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, introduced from Europe, swept through communities with devastating effect. Mortality could alter labor availability, family structures, and social hierarchies. Remedies were a mixture of indigenous knowledge, European medicine, and religious ritual. Understanding and adapting to these challenges was a daily task for ordinary people navigating an empire thousands of miles from Europe. The colonies were also hubs of cultural exchange. Artisans learned techniques from other continents, producing ceramics, textiles, and metalwork that reflected multiple traditions. Music and dance evolved as communities mixed, creating forms that were neither fully European nor indigenous. Foodways combined ingredients and preparation methods from multiple continents, demonstrating how ordinary life was a site of creativity, adaptation, and resilience. Through all this, ordinary people, farmers, miners, artisans, soldiers, clerics, made the empire function. Their labor, ingenuity, and adaptation allowed Spain to maintain control over territories that spanned oceans. Yet their experiences were uneven, shaped by location, social status, and chance. Some thrived, others barely survived. Most lived their lives in the quiet rhythms of work, family, and community, with the larger empire often felt indirectly through taxes, tribute, or the movement of goods. It is striking to consider that while kings, generals, and explorers take the spotlight in historical memory, the empire depended on these countless ordinary lives. Without them, the flow of silver, the building of towns, the maintenance of roads, and the administration of justice would have faltered. The Spanish Empire was as much a human network as a political or military structure, and its endurance rested on adaptation, resilience, and practical problem-solving at the local level. And so, as you imagine walking through a colonial town, hearing the market calls, the church bells, and the chatter of many languages, you see an empire in miniature, vast, hierarchical, controlled by distant authority, yet fundamentally dependent on the everyday actions, endurance, and survival of ordinary people. Which makes you wonder, how did these patterns of daily life influence the empire's long-term stability, and how might they have shaped the perspectives of those who lived through its expansion? By the mid-16th century, the flow of precious metals from the Americas had become the backbone of Spain's empire. Mines in Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia produced staggering quantities of silver and gold, fundamentally reshaping economies, societies, and even politics on multiple continents. But the story was not merely one of wealth, it was also one of labor, logistics, and the human costs hidden behind the glittering metal. In Mexico, the region of Zacatecas became a central hub of mining activity. Silver veins ran deep in rocky mountains, and extracting the ore required ingenuity, endurance, and skill. Miners worked in shifts that could extend for hours in stifling heat or freezing conditions. Hand tools, hammers, and chisels were standard, while fire-setting heating rock and then dousing it with water to crack it was a common but dangerous technique. Tunnels collapsed, toxic fumes accumulated, and accidents were frequent. Yet these mines produced enormous quantities of silver, enough to fund armies, fleets, and sprawling bureaucracies across the empire. In Peru, the Cerro Rico at Potosí became legendary. Discovered in 1545, this mountain was almost entirely composed of silver-rich ore. The city of Potosí grew rapidly, with tens of thousands flocking to work, trade, and supply the mining operation. Indigenous laborers were drafted under the meter system, a colonial adaptation of Inca labor obligations, which required communities to supply a quota of workers. Each man's contribution was immense, yet mortality rates were high due to exhaustion, altitude sickness, and exposure to mercury during refining. Mercury was central to the extraction process. The patio method, used to separate silver from ore, involved mixing crushed ore with water, salt, and mercury. The mercury bound with the silver, which could then be collected, leaving waste behind. Handling mercury was hazardous. Miners suffered neurological damage, respiratory issues, and sometimes death. The process was effective, yet it imposed a heavy toll on human health, a toll often invisible in accounts celebrating the wealth extracted. Transporting silver from mines to ports was another challenge. In mountainous regions, llamas and mules carried ingots along narrow trails to processing centers and river crossings. From there, convoys moved goods to coastal ports, where silver was loaded onto galleons destined for Seville or Veracruz. Every stage required careful planning, guards, and coordination to protect against bandits, pirates, and logistical mishaps. Losses en route could erase months of labor and investment. The silver, once in Spain, fueled not only the crown's ambitions but European economies more broadly. It paid for armies, built fortresses, and enriched merchants and nobles. Yet it also contributed to inflation, known as the price revolution, which affected the cost of living and strained the domestic economy. Ordinary Spaniards often saw little benefit, while debt mounted and reliance on American bullion deepened. The flow of silver had global consequences. A significant portion traveled from Spain to Asia, particularly China, where it became a medium of taxation and trade. European merchants used it to buy silk, porcelain, and spices, linking the Americas, Europe, and Asia in a triangular economic system. The Manila Galleons were a critical component, transporting American silver to the Philippines and then exchanging it for Asian goods. This circulation created unprecedented levels of global interconnectedness, long before the modern concept of globalization. Gold, though less abundant than silver, was equally prized. Early conquests focused on gold because of its visual and symbolic value. Cortés in Mexico and Pizarro in Peru seized treasures from temples, palaces, and local elites. These acts were both political and economic. Gold demonstrated Spanish supremacy and funded further expansion. The extraction of gold often involved looting as well as mining, leaving cultural destruction in its wake. Precious objects were melted down, ceremonial artifacts lost, and traditional economies disrupted. The extraction and shipment of metals also influenced urban development. Mining towns like Potosí, Zacatecas, and Guanajuato became bustling centers of commerce. Artisans, merchants, and officials congregated around the mines, supporting infrastructure for laborers and creating markets for goods. These towns were microcosms of the empire, hierarchical, interconnected, and reliant on a constant flow of resources. Yet they were also precarious, vulnerable to labor shortages, rebellion, or economic downturns. Indigenous communities faced dramatic transformations. Labor drafts, tribute obligations, and displacement reshaped their societies. Traditional agricultural production was often disrupted as men were conscripted into mines or transport work. Local elites navigated complex relationships with colonial authorities, balancing cooperation, negotiation, and resistance. Some were able to maintain influence, but many communities suffered long-term demographic, social, and cultural losses. The environmental impact was significant. Deforestation provided timber for construction and fuel for smelting, while rivers were often contaminated by mercury and other waste products. Mining landscapes were scarred, and local ecosystems altered. These changes, though less discussed in historical narratives, shaped the daily lives and health of populations around the mines, further linking wealth accumulation to environmental and human costs. Security was constant. Treasure convoys needed armed escorts, fortifications protected ports, and naval patrols defended against pirates. Banditry along mining routes was common, and the threat of attack could disrupt operations. Maintaining these networks required careful coordination, planning, and expenditure, further emphasizing that wealth extraction was as much about administration and logistics as brute force. Silver and gold also reinforced Spain's social and political hierarchies. Wealth flowed to the crown, which rewarded loyal nobles and military officers. Cities were adorned with churches, palaces, and plazas that demonstrated authority and prestige. In turn, the display of wealth reinforced obedience, religion, and cultural norms, creating a feedback loop where economic extraction legitimized political and social control. Yet the very abundance of American silver created new vulnerabilities. Inflation, over-reliance on bullion, and expectations of constant wealth led to fiscal crises. Wars, costly administration, and military expeditions drained reserves. The empire's dependence on distant resources exposed it to disruptions. Storms at sea, uprisings, or foreign attacks could create crises in Madrid or Seville, demonstrating the fragility beneath apparent dominance. Finally, the human cost of extraction was immense. Thousands of miners died in mines. Many more suffered illness, accidents, and long-term health effects. Indigenous laborers were subjected to coercion, harsh conditions, and disease. Slaves from Africa were sometimes employed, adding another layer of exploitation. These human dimensions, though often absent in triumphalist histories, were integral to the empire's ability to function. The glittering silver and gold carried with it countless stories of endurance, suffering, and survival. The global circulation of precious metals transformed the world economy, linking continents, currencies, and trade networks in ways unprecedented for the era. Spain's ability to extract, transport, and utilize these resources reinforced its status as a superpower. Yet it also revealed structural limits. Environmental degradation, human cost, administrative complexity, and economic dependence created vulnerabilities that would shape the empire's future. So as you imagine the flow of silver from high Andean mountains to Spanish galleons, and onward to China, think not only of the wealth it created, but of the human labor, logistical ingenuity, and social transformations that made it possible. Every ingot carried a story of endurance, coercion, adaptation, and survival. And you are left to wonder, could an empire built on such extraction sustain itself indefinitely, or was the very scale of wealth and human cost planting the seeds of eventual decline? By the mid-16th century, Spain's empire spanned oceans, continents, and cultures. The demand for labor to sustain agriculture, mining, and urban growth was immense, and indigenous populations decimated by disease, war, and forced labor were no longer sufficient to meet the empire's needs. Into this gap came enslaved Africans, transported across the Atlantic in a system that was brutal, complex, and global in its reach. The first arrivals of Africans to Spanish colonies occurred as early as the 1520s, often as domestic servants or laborers on plantations. As European settlements expanded and the mining economy grew, the demand for labor escalated. Sugar, one of the most labor-intensive crops, required planting, harvesting, and processing that could not be met by local populations alone. African laborers were imported in growing numbers to meet this demand. Enslaved Africans were typically transported via the transatlantic slave trade. Ships departed from ports in West Africa, carrying captives acquired through war, raiding, or local trade networks. Conditions aboard these vessels were horrific. People were shackled, confined to cramped holds, and subjected to disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Mortality rates were high, yet the survivors arrived in the Americas to face a new form of extreme labor. The journey itself was a brutal threshold into a life of exploitation. Once in the Americas, enslaved Africans were distributed according to labor needs. Some worked on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, others in tobacco fields, and still others in urban centers performing domestic or artisanal tasks. In Peru and Mexico, African laborers contributed to mining operations, sometimes alongside indigenous workers under the meter system. Their skills, resilience, and knowledge of agriculture and crafts made them indispensable to colonial economies. The labor system was strictly hierarchical. Enslaved Africans had few rights, subject to legal codes that defined their status, movement, and punishments. Owners had extensive authority, often reinforced by local militias or colonial law. Punishments for perceived infractions ranged from physical beatings to branding or sale. Yet enslaved communities developed strategies of survival, creating social networks, preserving cultural practices, and adapting knowledge to local environments. Religion, music, and oral traditions became forms of resilience, binding individuals to shared identity despite systemic oppression. Sugar production illustrates the scale and intensity of this labor. Fields required constant maintenance, clearing, planting, weeding, harvesting. Once This process was physically exhausting, often conducted in extreme heat, with injuries and disease common. The final product, raw sugar, was shipped across the Atlantic, generating immense profits while leaving the laborers exposed to relentless toil. In addition to plantations, mining operations relied heavily on enslaved labor. In regions such as Colombia and the Caribbean coast, Africans worked in extracting gold or assisting in silver operations alongside indigenous conscripts. Their knowledge of metallurgy, agriculture, and endurance under harsh conditions made them valuable, but the conditions were equally deadly. Long shifts, exposure to chemicals, and poor nutrition created high mortality rates. Families were often separated, and enslaved people were treated as interchangeable labor units rather than human beings with individual lives and histories. Spain's legal framework for slavery evolved over time. Laws attempted to regulate treatment, conversion to Christianity, and rights of ownership, though enforcement was inconsistent. The Crown sought to maintain a moral veneer, asserting obligations to convert and protect the enslaved. Yet economic imperatives often overrode these guidelines. Local authorities, settlers, and merchants interpreted regulations in ways that maximized profit, demonstrating the tension between imperial ideology and practical exploitation. African culture, however, persisted and adapted in the Americas. Enslaved communities maintained music, oral histories, and agricultural techniques that influenced local economies. In Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Santo Domingo, African traditions merged with European and indigenous practices, shaping cuisine, spiritual life, and crafts. These cultural legacies endured despite systemic violence and coercion, illustrating resilience in the face of oppression. Resistance was a constant feature of life under slavery. Enslaved Africans escaped, organized revolts, or negotiated small acts of autonomy. Maroon communities, settlements of escaped individuals in remote areas, became centers of resistance and cultural preservation. Spanish authorities viewed these communities as threats, sending expeditions to suppress them, but they often persisted, demonstrating the limits of control even within a highly hierarchical system. Women played essential roles in sustaining enslaved communities. Beyond working in fields or mills, they maintained households, preserved knowledge, and transmitted culture to children. Their labor extended into domestic spaces, providing food, care, and continuity within households and communities. Enslaved women's experiences were often gendered, combining the physical demands of labor with responsibilities for family survival, child rearing, and cultural preservation. Enslaved Africans were also instrumental in urban economies. In ports like Veracruz, Havana, and Cartagena, they worked as artisans, dock workers, and household servants. Their skills facilitated trade, commerce, and daily life, making them indispensable despite their legal and social marginalization. African influence was visible in architecture, crafts, and economic practices, even as systemic exploitation constrained their autonomy. Religious conversion was both a tool of control and a site of negotiation. Missionaries baptized enslaved Africans, taught Christian doctrine, and sought to instill obedience. Yet enslaved individuals often integrated Catholic practices with African spiritual traditions, creating syncretic religions that preserved identity while adapting to new realities. These practices reflected creativity, resilience, and the persistence of cultural memory. The transatlantic trade created global economic linkages. Silver and sugar funded Spanish enterprises, while enslaved laborers powered production. Ships carried goods, people, and ideas between Africa, the Americas, and Europe, linking continents in a network of extraction and commerce. Yet these connections were built on human suffering, coercion, and systemic violence, illustrating the hidden costs of imperial wealth. Mortality and demographic shifts transformed colonies. Indigenous populations declined dramatically due to disease and labor demands, while African populations increased, particularly in Caribbean and coastal regions. This demographic reshaping influenced social hierarchies, labor allocation, and cultural dynamics. Colonies became multicultural spaces, defined by asymmetrical power, survival strategies, and adaptation under conditions of oppression. Spain's reliance on enslaved labor also revealed broader vulnerabilities. Economic dependence on coerced work created social tensions, resistance, and ethical contradictions. The empire's reach depended on maintaining control over distant populations, yet constant rebellion, escape, and mortality demonstrated the limits of coercion. Human ingenuity, endurance, and resistance repeatedly shaped the functioning of the empire, despite legal and military oversight. The human cost of the transatlantic slave trade is staggering to imagine. Thousands died in transit, countless more endured brutal labor conditions, and generations lived under oppression. Yet these individuals shaped the economic, cultural, and social foundations of the Spanish Empire. Their contributions, often invisible in triumphalist histories, were essential to sustaining wealth, trade, and the very functioning of colonial society. As you reflect on this history, consider the complexity. Spain's global empire relied on extraction, administration, religion, and labor, but the human stories beneath the surface reveal endurance, adaptation, and resistance. Without enslaved Africans, the flow of silver, sugar, and trade would have faltered. The empire's success, then, was inseparable from the lives and deaths of those forced to sustain it. Which brings us to ask, how did these systems of forced labor shape not only the economy but the culture, resilience, and human landscape of the colonies for centuries to come? Imagine standing on the ramparts of a Spanish fort in the Caribbean during the 17th century. The sun beats down on thick stone walls, cannons point toward the horizon, and soldiers patrol the battlements. Behind the fort lies a town, thriving with trade and daily life, yet constantly aware of threats, pirates, rival European powers, and internal unrest. Defense was not optional for Spain. It was a continuous, complex, and costly necessity that shaped both colonial and imperial policies. Spain's empire, spanning continents and oceans, relied on military organization to maintain control. Garrisons were established in strategic locations, from the Caribbean islands to the Andean highlands, Mexico City, Manila, and coastal Africa. Soldiers included peninsulares, criollos, indigenous auxiliaries, and sometimes enslaved laborers. These men were trained in European techniques, but local conditions demanded adaptation. Tropical diseases, heat, altitude, and rugged terrain required resilience, improvisation, and careful supply management. Fortifications were central to Spain's defensive strategy. Coastal cities were surrounded by thick stone walls, bastions, and moats designed to withstand cannon fire and raids. Cities like Havana, Cartagena, and Veracruz became renowned for their formidable defenses, combining European engineering with local knowledge. Construction required immense resources, including stone, timber, and skilled labor, often imported from other colonies or Europe. Maintaining these structures demanded continuous effort, repairs, and reinforcement against weather, erosion, and enemy attacks. The Caribbean was a particularly challenging environment. Pirate attacks were frequent, targeting treasure fleets, ports, and coastal towns. English, Dutch, and French privateers exploited Spain's vast and sometimes thinly defended territories. To counter this, Spain developed a system of convoys, fleets of merchant ships escorted by warships. Ports were fortified, watchtowers dotted the coasts, and early warning networks transmitted intelligence on approaching threats. Even with these measures, raids could be devastating, destroying property, capturing treasure, and destabilizing local economies. Naval organization was equally vital. The Crown invested heavily in shipbuilding, creating fleets capable of transporting soldiers, cargo, and silver across oceans. Ships of the line, galleons, and smaller escort vessels were built in yards from Seville to Mexico. Crews had to be skilled in navigation, seamanship, and combat. Supply chains extended across the empire, ensuring repairs, provisions, and reinforcements could reach distant outposts. The success of the empire often depended on timely and well-protected movement of goods and personnel. Spanish military organization was hierarchical and bureaucratic. Commanders reported to governors, who in turn communicated with viceroys and councils in Europe. Orders were formalized through written dispatches, often requiring months to reach distant colonies. This delay meant local commanders had to exercise judgment, improvising in response to immediate threats. Discipline was strict, yet flexibility was essential. Miscommunication or hesitation could lead to catastrophic outcomes in both naval engagements and land defenses. In addition to conventional troops, Spain relied on local auxiliaries. Indigenous warriors were recruited for campaigns, often motivated by alliances, coercion, or incentives. Their knowledge of terrain, tactics, and survival in harsh environments was invaluable, especially in areas where European soldiers struggled with unfamiliar climates or geography. These alliances required careful negotiation, balancing Spanish authority with respect for local power structures. Fortifications were more than military tools. They were symbols of authority. A walled city communicated the crown's presence, deterring rebellion, signaling stability to merchants, and asserting dominance over indigenous and colonial populations. Bastions, cannons, and watchtowers served both practical and psychological functions. The maintenance of these structures required labor from soldiers, artisans, and local communities, integrating military preparedness into everyday life. Military campaigns extended beyond defense. Spain often engaged in expeditions to suppress rebellions, expand territory, or secure trade routes. These campaigns required logistics on a continental scale, moving troops, provisions, artillery, and supplies across mountains, rivers, and oceans. Planning involved detailed mapping, intelligence gathering, and coordination with local authorities. Success depended on endurance, skill, and sometimes sheer luck, as weather, terrain, and disease could undermine even the best prepared forces. The empire's military presence also intersected with the economy. Mines, plantations, and ports required protection, and garrisons ensured labor could be extracted and trade maintained. Soldiers often participated in building infrastructure, policing towns, and enforcing tribute systems. Their presence reinforced social hierarchies and enabled the crown to implement policies over vast territories, linking military organization directly to governance and economic exploitation. Spain's military technology evolved to meet challenges. Forts incorporated angled walls to deflect cannonballs. Bastions allowed overlapping fields of fire, and artillery placement was carefully calculated. Naval innovations, including galleon design and convoy tactics, balanced cargo capacity with defense. These technical developments were responses to both European rivals and the practical realities of distant colonies, demonstrating the empire's capacity to adapt to varied threats. Disease and environment were constant adversaries. Tropical climates, high altitudes, and unfamiliar diseases affected soldiers' health, often reducing effective manpower. Maintaining hygiene, nutrition, and morale was a continuous concern. Medical knowledge was limited, and local remedies were often combined with European practices. Survival depended not just on skill but on adaptation to local conditions, a recurring theme in the practical operation of the empire. Spain also faced challenges from rival European powers. The Dutch, English, and French sought to disrupt Spanish trade, seize colonies, or attack treasure fleets. Naval engagements required careful coordination, intelligence, and speed. The Spanish response combined fortifications, convoy systems, and preemptive strikes. Despite occasional losses, Spain's ability to maintain control over critical ports and trade routes demonstrated the effectiveness of integrated military planning. Internal stability was equally important. Garrisons enforced law, collected tribute, and suppressed uprisings. The crown relied on a combination of coercion, negotiation, and ritual authority to maintain order. Military presence reinforced social hierarchies, ensured labor compliance, and projected power to both settlers and indigenous populations. Soldiers were not only defenders but instruments of governance, blurring the line between military and civil authority. Logistics remained the backbone of military effectiveness. Supplying forts, galleons, and expeditions required detailed planning. Food, weapons, ammunition, and building materials had to be transported across oceans and rugged terrain. Delays or miscalculations could cripple operations. The empire's success relied on networks of ports, warehouses, and roads, illustrating the interdependence of military, economic, and administrative systems. Training and discipline were continuous concerns. Soldiers underwent drills, artillery crews practiced firing routines, and naval officers refined navigation and combat skills. Indigenous auxiliaries and local recruits were trained to complement European forces, creating hybrid military capabilities. This blend of imported technique and local adaptation was essential to managing the diverse environments and challenges of a global empire. Despite careful planning, failures occurred. Pirate attacks, rebellions, and shipwrecks tested the empire's resilience. Responses often combined immediate tactical action with longer-term strategic adjustments, rebuilding fortifications, revising convoy routes, and strengthening alliances. Each crisis reinforced lessons about the limits and strengths of the empire's military system, shaping future policies and innovations. Finally, the human dimension of military life was profound. Soldiers endured harsh conditions, long deployments, and separation from families. Mortality rates were high, not only from combat but from disease, malnutrition, and accidents. Yet their presence enabled the functioning of the empire, protecting trade, enforcing labor systems, and projecting authority across continents. Military organization was as much about sustaining human endurance as it was about strategic positioning or technological superiority. Looking across the empire, from the Caribbean to Manila, from Mexican highlands to Andean valleys, Spain's military infrastructure emerges as a web of forts, galleons, troops, and local alliances. It demonstrates the empire's capacity to project power across vast distances, but also its dependence on human resilience, logistical skill, and constant adaptation. Without these structures, the empire's wealth and reach would have been far more precarious. Which raises the question, how sustainable was an empire that relied so heavily on distant fortifications, long supply chains, and the endurance of soldiers scattered across the globe? By the 17th century, Spain's empire was no longer merely a collection of colonies. It had become a global network of governance, culture, trade, and religion. From the high Andes to the Caribbean islands, from Mexico to the Philippines, Spanish influence was visible in architecture, law, language, and ritual. Towns were organized around plazas, churches, and administrative buildings. Roads, bridges, and harbors connected distant regions, enabling the movement of people, goods, and information. This infrastructure, combined with military garrisons, administrative hierarchies, and economic systems, allowed Spain to maintain an empire that spanned oceans. Religion, particularly Catholicism, was central to the imperial project. The crown saw itself as a defender of the faith, and missionary activity extended into nearly every colony. Indigenous populations were baptized, converted, and integrated into church structures, creating hybrid religious practices that blended European and local traditions. In Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines, religious festivals incorporated pre-colonial rituals, producing syncretic celebrations that endured for centuries. Churches were centers of not only worship, but education, social organization, and cultural transmission. Clerics often acted as intermediaries between indigenous populations and colonial authorities, reinforcing both spiritual and political hierarchies. Education, while limited, was a tool of social and cultural control. Schools attached to churches and missions taught reading, writing, and religious doctrine. Indigenous elites sometimes gained literacy, allowing them to navigate colonial bureaucracy, while European-born Spaniards and Criollos accessed broader educational opportunities. Knowledge of multiple languages, Spanish, indigenous tongues, and, in some cases, African languages enabled governance, trade, and diplomacy. Literacy and learning became intertwined with power, giving those who could read and write advantages in social mobility and administration. Cultural influence extended beyond religion and education. Art, architecture, music, and literature reflected a fusion of European styles with local materials, techniques, and traditions. Cities featured cathedrals, plazas, and civic buildings modeled after European designs, but adapted to local climates and resources. Artisans, often indigenous or African, contributed technical skills and aesthetic sensibilities, producing ceramics, textiles, and metalwork that merged diverse cultural heritages. Music and dance similarly blended European and local traditions, forming expressive forms of identity and community resilience. Economically, the empire remained dependent on resource extraction. Silver and gold from the Americas funded both local administration and European ambitions. Agriculture, particularly sugar, cacao, and later coffee, relied heavily on indigenous labor and enslaved Africans. Trade networks extended across the Atlantic and Pacific, linking Spain to Asia, Europe, and Africa. The Manila Galleons, for example, carried silver from the Americas to Manila in exchange for silk, spices, and luxury goods from China and Southeast Asia. Economic activity created wealth for the crown and elites, but also generated profound inequalities, exploited labor, and environmental change. The empire's administration was complex and multi-layered. Viceroys, governors, and local councils exercised authority under royal oversight, but geographic distances required delegation and improvisation. Delays in communication could lead to inconsistent enforcement of laws, corruption, or local adaptation of policies. Indigenous and local intermediaries played critical roles in bridging cultural, linguistic, and administrative gaps. The empire's stability relied as much on these networks of human relationships as on formal decrees or military might. Despite its power, Spain's empire faced structural vulnerabilities. Overextension made governance difficult. Wars in Europe, piracy, and colonial rebellions strained resources. Economic dependence on bullion led to inflation and fiscal crises. Labor shortages, demographic shifts, and disease affected productivity and social cohesion. Environmental degradation from mining, agriculture, and urban development altered landscapes and undermined sustainability. These pressures highlighted the fragile balance between wealth, power, and the practical realities of managing a global empire. Political and military challenges were constant. European rivals, including France, England, and the Dutch Republic, contested Spanish dominance through warfare, piracy, and colonization. The Spanish crown invested heavily in fortifications, garrisons, and fleets to protect trade routes and territories. Yet maintaining these defenses required enormous human and material resources, stretching the empire's capacity. Naval losses, logistical failures, or uprisings revealed the limits of Spain's control, even as the empire projected power across continents. Internal social hierarchies shaped life within colonies. Peninsulares, Criollos, mixed-race populations, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans occupied distinct roles in the colonial system. Laws codified status and rights, but daily life involved negotiation, adaptation, and survival strategies. Indigenous leaders sometimes retained authority through collaboration, while African communities preserved culture, and created networks of resistance. Ordinary people, through labor, skill, and ingenuity, sustained the empire's economy and social structure, often without recognition. Resistance was a constant undercurrent. Indigenous uprisings, maroon communities of escaped enslaved Africans, and local revolts challenged Spanish authority. While the crown and local officials relied on military force, alliances, negotiation, and adaptation, the persistence of resistance demonstrated that empire was never fully secure. These acts of defiance were not only survival strategies but also cultural preservation, reflecting the human capacity to navigate, endure, and resist oppression. Spain's cultural and religious legacy persisted even amid decline. Language, law, religion, and urban planning continued to shape societies long after Spanish political authority waned. Catholicism became deeply rooted in the Americas and the Philippines, while Spanish became the lingua franca in multiple regions. Colonial architecture and city layouts influenced urban development for centuries. Artistic, musical, and culinary traditions emerged from the intersection of European, indigenous, and African cultures, producing enduring hybrid identities. The empire also left a global imprint on economic and political systems. Trade networks linked Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, creating early forms of globalization. The flow of silver-shaped European economies encouraged international trade and transformed local markets in Asia. Colonial administrative practices influenced governance structures, taxation systems, and legal traditions in regions under Spanish control. Even decline could not erase the profound structural and cultural transformations established over centuries. Decline began to manifest in the 17th and 18th centuries. Military overreach, economic dependence on bullion, fiscal crises, and competition from emerging European powers eroded Spanish supremacy. Wars in Europe, piracy, and colonial unrest drained resources. Local elites and colonial populations sometimes exploited weaknesses, seeking autonomy or alternative economic arrangements. While Spain retained enormous territories, the empire's cohesion and dominance were increasingly fragile. Despite decline, Spain's empire achieved remarkable endurance. Its integration of military, administrative, economic, and cultural systems allowed control over vast distances for centuries. This endurance depended not only on kings and generals but on the daily labor, negotiation, and resilience of countless individuals, indigenous peoples, African laborers, European settlers, clerics, artisans, and soldiers. Their collective efforts enabled the flow of wealth, the maintenance of authority, and the persistence of cultural influence across continents. Reflecting on Spain's global empire, one sees a complex interplay of power, culture, and human experience. Wealth and authority were inseparable from labor, logistics, and adaptation. Religion and education reinforced governance while shaping identity. Art, music, and daily life reflected cultural fusion and resilience. Economic exploitation and forced labor coexisted with negotiation, ingenuity, and survival strategies. The empire's story is not only one of conquest and administration, but also of the countless lives that sustained it, adapted to its demands, and transformed its legacies. Ultimately, Spain's rise, expansion, and decline offer lessons about the challenges of managing vast empires. Overextension, reliance on distant resources, social hierarchies, and the limits of military and bureaucratic control reveal the fragility beneath apparent power. Yet the cultural, economic, and social legacies endure, shaping societies across continents long after the crown's authority faded. The empire's history is inseparable from the human stories of endurance, survival, and adaptation that made it possible. And so, as you consider the Spanish Empire in its entirety, from conquest to decline, from gold and silver to cultural synthesis, you are left with a question that echoes through centuries. How does power, wealth, and human ingenuity interact to create lasting influence? And what does it cost the ordinary lives that sustain it?